And you're on Rhema 94.9. It is 4:15, and it's time for Creation Ministries International. And we have Dr. John in the studio this afternoon. Good afternoon, Dr. John.
Good afternoon, Mick.
It's awesome to have you back again. Of course, this is our second week. Last week, we had a very interesting talk. And as a result of that chat last week, we've got a couple of questions, Dr. John. And one of them in particular was, why did the blue fox travel? Now, we were talking about the blue fox being a little animal that ran thousands of kilometres in no time.
Yeah, Mick, it was. It was an Arctic blue fox that the researchers fitted with a tracking device and just followed it for, a couple of months. And they saw that it covered over 4,000 kilometres in a little over 10 weeks, which is a huge distance. Mm. Anyway, our listener says, why? Well,
fair question.
Yeah, I didn't know why, so I thought, I better go back to the original articles in the comments to see if I can find out why. And believe it or not, there wasn't any reason. It looks as though the researchers just knew that these animals travel around quite a bit, and they decided to fit one with a tracking device. And it was just for interest, but they were absolutely amazed with the results, because this fox covered, as I said, over 4,000 Ks in a bit over 10 weeks. Yep. And on some days it did 150 Ks, and other days about 10, And it seemed to be just wandering around sort of aimlessly, but tending to drift from east to west. But what they observed was that it got from part of Norway to part of Canada in that time, which is a pretty fair step.
And of course, the question I had last week was, how did it do that when there's water there, but it was ice?
Yeah, it was. And apparently the time of the year, and I think it was about February, March, then most of that area is still frozen. So, and obviously the animals like foxes, what they're doing is foraging for food. And it seems that mostly they dine on the scraps that are leftovers from larger predators like polar bears. If a polar bear kills a seal and eats what it wants and leaves a bit, then there's a bit left for the fox.
He gets the leftovers.
I mean, maybe they kill little rabbits or hares or something like that themselves. But yeah, no, it looks as though they just eat the leftovers from the larger predators.
Now we were talking about this for a reason. We're talking about why the animals spread so far.
Yeah, well, that's right. And because that's another question that we get. How did they all spread so fast if they all landed from the ark in the mountains of Ararat or whatever?
Yep.
How did they get all over the world? And it just shows you that animals can spread very fast. And I also gave the example last week of how red foxes got from the eastern states to Western Australia in under a century here in Australia. And
it's not quite as fast as the blue fox.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't one individual too. It was just the reproduction rate, and they colonised that sort of area over that time. And rabbits did it in about 50 years. Yep. It wasn't very long at all. But look, what the researchers found was completely unexpected, but very interesting, that animals do travel a great deal, much more than you might expect. So anyway, that's the best answer I could come up with for why did the blue fox travel. We don't know.
Yeah, but it sort of opens up so many other questions. Why the kangaroos only in Australia? And we spoke a little bit about that last week. You were saying, yes, they travel down and there's sort of kangaroo ancestors going back on the trail back towards where the ark stopped as well. And, why are lions in some areas and why are cheetahs in other areas and why are horses in some areas? And I guess it's because certain areas the predators moved to, and certain animals couldn't stand. But like obviously, there's no kangaroos where there's lions.
No, it doesn't pay for them to be around lions. And they got to Australia and they thrived because there were no predators. You know, and I mean the dingoes probably came later because the spread of humanity from the same area where the ark landed was a couple of hundred years later. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about that today too, because it's related to the second question that we got.
Yes.
And you can read that out, and we'll see what that says.
Yes. Well, the second question from last week was, what son of Noah did the Aussie Aboriginals come from?
Yeah. Well, it's a very, very good question, and it's not easy to give a definite answer, because if you think about it, what the Bible tells us, that Noah had these three sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and it says that each one of them had a number of sons, and there are 16 that are named altogether. That's Noah's grandsons. Mm-hmm. But the Bible only talks about sons. It doesn't talk about daughters. So we have to presume that maybe there was the same amount of daughters as well. I mean, there'd have to be, otherwise, if they were all men, the human race would have died out, wouldn't they?
Yes.
But, so we have to presume that. And all of these, Noah's grandsons and his granddaughters, they were all first cousins, right? And they all spoke the same language at that time. They all congregated in the one area for about 4 or 5 generations after the flood, around the area that where they built the Tower of Babel.
Yep.
So there would have been pretty ready intermarriage with all of these cousins. You know, they wouldn't have restricted themselves to their own paternal group.
Yes.
So over that 200 years, I imagine that everybody in the male line would have known who their male ancestors were. I mean, if you look at what the Bible says about the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you know, they can all give their fathers, right? So it looks as though people tended to do that, but once the Tower of Babel, once God confounded the languages at Babel, there would have been all of these mixtures of all the genetics from both the three sons and their wives. Yep. So it wouldn't have been that there was just one genetic line. But the Bible does tell us that when God confounded their languages, he also did it by paternal line. So it does seem that most of the ones who could, say, identify themselves as descendants of Japheth, they seem to have tended towards the northern areas. Maybe they were more light-skinned and because it was an ice age. Yep. And, when we say an ice age, the ice was in the northern areas. It wasn't in the equatorial areas. And so they didn't need as much vitamin D, so they tended to go into those areas. Whereas the Shemites, the Arabs and the Jewish people and so on, tended to congregate around the Middle East. Yep. But they weren't the only ones who did, because the Bible tells us that the Philistines and the Canaanites, they were all descendants of Ham, right? Yep. So they were there as well. And it does seem that the Ham descendants went south to Africa and then east to Asia, and then because the Bering Strait would have been walkable at that time with all the water locked up in ice, yep. They would have travelled across the Bering Strait to North America and then down all the way down to South America. So that's how those people got there, and they tended to be Hamitic. Now, the Australian Aborigines did come here through Asia, we believe. But there could have been a couple of different streams, because when Captain Cook arrived, it is estimated that when Captain Cook arrived, that there were only about 300,000 Aboriginal people in Australia. Mm-hmm. And Australia's a pretty vast sort of a country. So maybe some came down through Indonesia, across the Indonesian archipelago to northwestern Australia, and others down through PNG to northeastern Australia. So it's interesting. We could probably say they would mainly trace back to Ham, but the mixture would have been great. They would have had all of the other brothers and sisters and cousins and all of that mixed in.
Yep. All right. You are with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. It is 4:26. We've got a little break right now. We'll be back with Dr. John shortly. If you have any questions, please send them through to us. The number to text is 0401 949 949. Fall, you're on 94.9. It's 23 minutes to 5, and we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. And look, he can answer any of your questions. Just send them through. Text 0401 949 949. And already this week we've been answering a few questions from last week, which is quite interesting. And Dr. John, you mentioned just before that there was probably about 300,000 Aboriginals in Australia. Which I found quite interesting, when Captain Cook got here.
Yeah, well, that's a secular estimate. It's not a Christian estimate, so it certainly comes from secular sources, and that's not a huge number, and it's probably consistent with what the Bible says, because remember, the Bible specifically says that everybody on the face of the earth is descended from those survivors of the ark.
Yep.
Right? Now, according to the Bible, the flood was about 4,500 years ago, and the dispersion from Babel a couple of hundred years after that. Mm-hmm. So, where do the 50 to 60,000 years of supposed Aboriginal settling in Australia come from? Because it obviously conflicts with the Bible.
Yep.
Now, we would have to say, because we stand by what the Bible says, that those 50 to 60,000 years have to be a total fiction, just like we say the millions and billions of years are a total fiction. Mm-hmm. And so where did the 50 to 60,000 years come from? Right, well, it hasn't come from Aboriginal tradition, right, because the Aboriginal people didn't keep a calendar. And their tradition only spoke of a long time. And we know that when you look at population growths, it doesn't take very long for even at very, very low population growth rates for a small number of people to become millions in less than 10 years, right? So how come only 300,000 or so in 50 or 60,000 years?
Yep.
Okay. Well, where does it come from? Well, as you might expect, it didn't come from the Aboriginal people themselves, but it came from the white man's highly doubtful dating methods. Mm-hmm. We've talked about those before, haven't we?
Yep.
And it seems that those big numbers of years only come from about the late 1960s, so it's not long ago. Up until that time, it was generally believed that the Aboriginal people might have been here about 10,000 years. Right, that's up until the late 1960s. But then there was a discovery of some burnt skeletal remains at Lake Mungo in western New South Wales, and testing of the bone gave a carbon-14 date of about 19,000 years. So that was about double what the previous estimate was.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty enthusiastically accepted by the researchers.
Mm-hmm.
But then they then found that there was a bit of charcoal in the same sort of area, and that gave a date of about 26,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, 26,000 years is a bit better than 19,000.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've talked before, researchers seem to be in competition to see who can get the oldest date. And as they continued researching that area in Lake Mungo, there were some more bones found not too far away, and they did some testing on the sand that those bones were buried in by using a different scientific way of estimating dates.
That's good, because we've already talked about how carbon dating can
be
not very accurate.
And bear in mind that you've got Dr. Taz Walker next week, and he's the expert on these, so I would suggest that you get him to thoroughly explain the problems with carbon-14 dating.
All right.
But anyway, this was, I think, tested by thermoluminescence or something like that, and that gave a date of 46,000 years. So here we go. We've almost doubled the time of occupation in the land.
Yep.
And then another researcher got some dates of 60,000 years by a different technique. Well, the 46,000 years people didn't like to be upstaged like that, so there was a bit of a dispute. So, but eventually they've settled on the 50 to somewhere between 50 and 60,000.
Right.
But look, the truth is, Mick, that is where the dates come from.
Yep.
They don't come from Aboriginal tradition. They come from the very, very dubious so-called scientific means of estimating dates on bones and charcoal and sand and all of this sort of stuff.
Yep.
So really, if you take what the Bible says, then the Bible says the Aboriginal people have only been here probably less than 4,000.
Yes.
Yeah. So there you go. But Taz Walker would be the person to ask about that.
That makes sense. I mean, I just did a quick calculation in my head a little while ago about just the three sons of Noah. And, you mentioned that, they had 16 boy children. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So 16 boy children, potentially 16 girl children.
Yeah.
There's 32. That's the first generation after. Now, it was only a few generations, 3 or 4, then all of a sudden everyone was dispersed. You're already in the thousands. That's how quickly that number of people grow. That's why populations in most countries, except obviously China recently, because they had a one-child policy and they're trying to, stop it from happening. But when you just let people breed, they breed quickly.
Yeah, they do. And populations can become very, very high very, very quickly. But there's another thing that I wanted to mention here. We say this is what the Bible says. Now, we know that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, including the book of Genesis, which is where the story of the flood comes from. And you think, well, how on earth did Moses in his day get all of that information?
Yep.
But when you think about it, it would have been passed down orally, but if you think about it, Adam lived 930 years, right? And in his descent line, we find Methuselah, who's the oldest person who ever lived, at 969.
Yep.
But Adam was alive for about the first 250 years of Methuselah's life. So Methuselah was able to get that story of creation and the fall absolutely from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
Now, Methuselah was Noah's grandfather, right?
Yep.
And Methuselah died in the year of the flood, at which time Noah was 600 years old.
Yep.
So Noah had associated with his grandfather for 600 years, who had associated with Adam for 250 years.
Yep.
So, you know, the story wouldn't have been too garbled by this stage.
Yeah.
And then Shem, who's Noah's son, right? He was 100 years old when the flood came, and he lived for about 450 years after that. So he actually knew Abraham.
Uh-huh.
Right, so Abraham gets the same information from Shem. In fact, Shem was still alive when Isaac was born. But you know, it's not too many generations for these stories to have been passed down.
When you think about it, Adam lived for about 1/7 of all time. You look back at it. Yeah, it's remarkable.
It is. Yeah, oh yeah. And as we've explained many times, the reason why they lived for such ages is because they were created perfect in the beginning. And it was only really with the massive climate change at the flood that those long ages started to come down. But Abraham's father Terah still lived over 200 years, and then Abraham was 175 when he died. So we see the downward progression after the flood.
Yep. And scientifically, you're a doctor. You've seen it that every generation we're breaking down. We're not getting better. We're not
getting better. The genetic deterioration is inexorable, and it just gets worse and worse.
Mm. Okay, well, Dr. John, thank you so much. Another week has come to an end. Yes, if anybody does have any questions now, you'll have to send them through for our next week's speaker. And, he'll be able to answer your questions, Dr. Taz Walker. If you do have any questions, please send them through to our text line. It is 0401 949 949. Thank you so much, Dr. John, for another good week.
Thanks, Mick. And listeners, bear in mind Taz is the expert on this dating system. So they're the sort of questions you want to get him to answer.
You're on 94.9. It is 12 minutes to 5.